All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to California History. I hope you're all doing well. I hope everybody's healthy, safe, and sane through all of this stuff. Me, I'm trying to fray at the edges a little bit. It's getting a little difficult. I'm not going to deny that. But let's just get into the lecture. You didn't come here to hear me complain. Came here to be educated on California history, at least as much as you need to get a grade in this class. Anyway, all right. Whoops. So today we're going to look at, this is a long lecture. I'm not sure if we're going to do this whole one today. I have it separated into two parts, and we'll just kind of see how things are going, where I'm at at the end of part one. It might be broken into two separate videos. But this is a long section on immigration and xenophobia, which is also tied to eugenics. If you know anything about eugenics, I'm trying to, use breeding programs to, to make better human beings. California, it's tied to racism and some pretty horrible stuff. California was an epicenter of eugenics in America. But that's in the later part of this lecture. First, we're going to talk about immigration. So, last thought we're talking about Chinese immigration. I've mentioned, some Irish immigration, a little bit of Australian immigration, like all the, different kinds of people coming, because of the gold rush. But also, that sort of died down by the late 19th century, and it was mostly more Americans that had been coming in for a long time. And then there's a second wave of immigration that's from people that really had not been in the United States and in California in large numbers until around about 1900 or so. So in this era, between 1870 and 1920, 12 million immigrants came over from the United States, most of them coming from Europe, a lot of them coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So you have Russians, a lot of Russian Jews were coming. We're not going to talk much about them because there was not a huge settlement of Russian Jews and Eastern Europeans really in California. We had much more of Southern Europe immigration. So lots of Italians, Spanish, Greeks, Portuguese, had not had a large presence in the United States, and they're going to be coming in huge numbers. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why. There's basically a bunch of destabilization going on in Europe, a remaking of their maps, a lot of racism going on there, making new nations based on ethnicity. And if you are in, if you are in this nation that is now based around his ethnicity, so you're in an area that's that becomes Serbia, and it's like Serbia is for the Serbs, and if you happen to not be ethnically Serbian, life might be becoming more and more difficult for you. So you have that happening in different places all around Europe. So where are you going to go? Go to the country where ethnicity is not supposed to matter. It's the land of immigrants. So you have all of these people coming to the United States and in massive numbers. And this is the era we think of immigration, of people coming in on big barges into New York Harbor and seeing the Statue of Liberty and going through Ellis Island. I think of American Tail, Fievel, the little mouse immigrant. Papa, that whole thing. That's the era of, as we think of as being immigration. Because like I said, all these people have been coming before. And of course, Ellis Island in New York, but we had our own equivalent of that, Angel Island, here in the San Francisco Bay. But we're not really going to talk about that because, well, there's not really much to say about it. You can still go visit Angel Island and learn more. So California becomes like I said, a popular destination for Southern Europeans for a number of reasons. For one thing, it's the climate here and soil, like the terrain is very similar to, say, like Italy is. Italians can come over here, and if they farmed in Italy, you can pick up farming here very easily. We live in more or less a Mediterranean style climate. And that was one reason. They're gonna have a lot of them coming here. Also, a lot of these people are Catholic, and California had an outsized number of Catholics because of the long, Mexican heritage. There's still many Mexican families in California, and of course, many Irish had been coming here during the gold rush years. So, because they're fleeing famine in Ireland, and California was the place to go. So, especially, in San Francisco and Northern California, huge numbers of Irish coming here. So, they feel sort of safety in numbers kind of thing. Catholics were not treated very well, and in large parts of the United States, and here they are. And it's weird for us now. We're going to see some like a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment coming through this section, and it's weird now to think like about discrimination against Catholics. That seems like just who cares, about that kind of thing. But people really did. There's the conspiracy theories of Catholics coming here, and this weird idea that the Pope could they have loyalty to the Pope over the loyalty to America, and one day the Pope could just be like, rise up and overthrow America, and they have to do it because the Pope told them to. They have that. There's that sort of stupid mentality about, for anti-Catholicism, and it just goes back to different reasons for people to hate each other, different reasons to discriminate against other people. Many Protestants didn't considered Catholicism to be somewhere between Christianity and witchcraft, practically. So But here, since we had a large number of them, there's definitely anti-Catholic sentiment, but less of it because of the large Catholic population that was already here. You also start getting large numbers of, do I need anything else in that? I don't think I need to say anything else there. Large numbers of Japanese coming at this time. The reasons for this are sort of complicated. Japan had been closed off to the world. The whole island had been closed, with basically no people allowed to go in or out. They didn't allow foreigners in there for hundreds of years until 1853, when it finally does open up, thanks to an American admiral. Basically forces Japan to open up. They modernize really quickly. They open up to the world and become this sort of overnight, where they had been this this behind the times, practically still living in medieval times, into the 19th century. They send people all around the world to pick up, learn modern business practices, modern industry, and they had been this very military oriented society, and they're going to put that same energy into reforming into like I said, business and industry and things like that. So by the late 1800s, their Japanese immigrants are looking for somewhere else to be able to go, and for the same reasons a lot of people had come to California. They're going to come here too. The gold rush is over, but there's going to be a lot of farmers, a lot of Japanese fishermen coming here, and there will be a lot of anti-Japanese discrimination. A lot of Americans, a lot of white people at the time really did not see any difference between Japanese and Chinese, and they were already discriminatory towards Chinese. So this is just another a group, and there have been lots of laws passed against them. There's even discussions of having a Japanese Exclusion Act, but Japan was able to prevent that, where China had been a relatively weak country, very destabilized, because of the Opium Wars and things like that. They couldn't do anything to defend their people, the immigrants who had come over here, you know, they're nationals that were in the United States. Whereas Japan became a very strong country. They, in 1905, they beat Russia, the Russian Empire, in a war, and everybody was kind of shocked, like, whoa, these guys are like, we thought they were a backward nation, this is a backward Asian country that nobody took seriously, and now they beat one of the most powerful militaries in the world. You know, so Japan, you know, has a lot of military and diplomatic clout because of that. And President Theodore Roosevelt had negotiated a peace between Japan and Russia in that. So Roosevelt had kind of a special relationship with Japan. And they were able to say, like, hey, we know you're treating our people badly in California and on the West Coast. Don't do that. Like, you're not allowed to, you know, there will be consequences, you know, whether, you know, trading or you know, perhaps military consequences to, you know, all this discrimination. And I think it's really embarrassing for the Japanese government if there had been some sort of like Japanese Exclusion Act passed. So they were able to prevent that. And you have large numbers of Japanese coming here, settling down. And in this deal to not have a Japanese Exclusion Act, Teddy Roosevelt makes a deal with them, what's known as the Gentleman's Agreement, that saying, we won't discriminate against the Japanese people that are here if you guys don't pass won't pass the Japanese Exclusion Act. We won't discriminate against the people that are here, but no new immigrants coming in. And Japan stopped issuing passports to the United States during this time. But there was an exception to that, where if a Japanese man was here and wanted to have a bride, you know, have his wife join him, then she would be allowed to do it. But you have the sort of same problem that you had before, you know, with all of, you know, mainly the Japanese people have been coming here, just like all other immigrants coming here, were young men coming by themselves, you know, had planned to be here sort of temporarily and make a good life for themselves. You don't want to start a family, but but they don't already have wives. So this new system came up of it being known as picture brides, where they're going to basically set up these Japanese men here on the West Coast with Japanese and Korean women, you know, back in their home countries. Korea was part of the growing Japanese Empire at this time. That's a long, complicated story too. But anyway, they're going to set up these, you know, these matchmaking. And when I first heard about picture brides, I had envisioned this idea of being like catalogs, like they were sending like catalogs to Japanese men here of you know, pictures of Japanese women, and they just like pick one out, like a mail order bride kind of thing. And that's not the case. What it was is the Japanese man would send a picture of himself back home to his family. They would pass it around, you know, to different people and to try and find someone to match with. And Japanese women, you know, that were wanted to get married, you know, gave their pictures to the family, and that gets passed here in California. So it was this sort of long distance, sort of like, you know, before internet dating, kind of, you know, internet dating, you know, setting up strangers, you know, somewhere between internet dating and arranged marriages, because basically the families are planning a lot of this stuff. But, you know, there is consent from, you know, from the man and the woman to be able to do it. And then once they decide we're going to have a match, the men or the women back in Japan would sign a book. They'd come in with both families, and all they have to do to be legally married there was sign their names on an official Japanese government book saying these two people are married. So in the eyes of the Japanese government, they are now officially married, even though they have never met. But that's enough for the woman to get on a boat, come here to the United States. The man would meet her down in the harbor. And right when she gets off the boat on the dock, they would have a wedding ceremony that would officially make these two married. And that's, you know, that's basically how Japanese women came here. In this period between like 1905, 1906 up into the 1920s, you know, any Japanese women came here, they came as picture brides. If any of you have Japanese ancestry, that had been here for generations, there's probably a picture bride somewhere in your past. So, like I said, you have many immigrants coming from many different places, different kinds of people that had not been here before. Of course, they're going to be discriminated against. A lot of them are going to go into farming. A lot of these people that were coming, these weren't rich, educated people for the most part. They're rural farmers. And they're going to, in this growing California agricultural system, they're basically become migrant laborers who travel around the state wherever there's a harvest. One day you're picking lettuce and salinas, and then then you do you become a lumberjack for a while up in the Sierra Nevadas. Then you go down and you harvest wheat in the Central Valley. You have all this kind of stuff like moving around. But these people were always, like I said, they're immigrants in this country. They don't have permanent homes. A lot of them don't have families. Nobody really knows they're here. They're really easy to be discriminated against. And we're going to see a case of that in just a second. But there was one group that was trying to defend them. These people that, were thought to be almost undefendable because of their sort of transient nature. The IWW was this new, extremely left-wing socialist, really going up to communist, even in some cases anarchist. It's kind of like, all leftist politics was really big right then, very radical. So you have all these different sort of leftist groups that are very pro-union, trying to form a union for everybody, not just have a union for specialized workers that work over here. We do the specific thing on the railroad, or like the specific workers, working in a factory. They want to cover all people that need defense, including migrant laborers, including including these immigrants. So it's a big job to do, but California is the place where they're going to do it. And there's a story that I always enjoy about a strike and labor movement not far from us right now. This is up in Wheatland, kind of close to Sacramento area, where the biggest farm in the state, basically the biggest employer of the person who gave the most jobs every harvest season, was this guy called Durst. This is Durst Ranch, and he, I thought I had his first name on here, but I don't have it. But it's okay. And he grows hops there. Hops are in beer, it's mainly used to be able to make beer. They use a lot of hops these days, a lot of sort of specialty beers. If you have a specialty beer that tastes like marijuana, you have those ones that they smell and taste super weedy. That's strong in hops. I don't like that taste very much, but a lot of beer experts do. But you need some hops for any kind of beer. And basically, Durst Ranch is one of the biggest hop suppliers in the entire country. And every year, when harvest season comes around, people travel from all across the West Coast to come there and get jobs. All of these different migrant laborers, most of them immigrants, relatively new to California. And in this year, 1913, Durst had sent out flyers all across the state promising any white man who came to the farm was guaranteed a job. So, being guaranteed any sort of work is promising. They got a flyer that's going to tell them that. 2,800 people show up at Durst Ranch, but it really only has 1,500 jobs. And this is great for Durst because now, all these people that came here, they use what resources they can do because they think they get here because they think there's a job here. And they were going to end up just hanging around hoping a job opens up. So Durst hires these 1,500 people, and if anybody complains and steps out of line, boom, you're fired. And we got somebody else, you know, we have twice as many people waiting nearby to take this job. So he's able to treat these workers incredibly shitty. Um, he pays them only $1 for every 100 pounds of hops that they pick, which is, you know, that's a lot of hops, you know, getting $1. And even worse, that it gets weighed after it gets cleaned, so that makes it lose weight. And they don't get to see the weighing and cleaning process. They basically give it to somebody. It goes into a warehouse, and like they say, well, you give us 100 pounds, but it only came down to 15 pounds. So, you know, here's 15 cents. You know, they're ripping them off monetarily with that. And so most of them are making, you know, somewhere around $1.50 a day. And there was, the only place to stay was tents that he charged, that Durst charged for. Is sometimes he's charging 75 cents a night. So they're paying you know, half of their wages just to be able to sleep on the property, to be able to work again. So they're getting totally ripped off in that. There's no close water nearby. There's just no streams or wells. But Durst had his cousin selling lemonade at really high prices in the fields. So just to be able to drink something while you're working, you're putting a bunch of money into that. So you have all of this stuff where the workers are frustrated, but they're here. They have to do something. And it turns out there were some IWW members in the group. They call them Wobblies. And the IWW trained people. They didn't just have like union representatives to go show up somewhere and like to tell people, oh, here's what your rights are. They trained the actual migrant workers. You know, they would have these like workshops. You know, if you're a migrant worker and you want to know more about your rights and you want to know about the IWW, they come and train you, and then you become a wobbly. So when something like this happens, they could basically form a union on the spot. They know how to labor organize. They've been trained in all these sort of labor techniques. So it's you know, it's the actual workers, you know, within, not from the outside, who are pushing to form this, saying like, hey, we're going to form a union and we're going to strike. If we all do it together, then nobody's picking the hops, and you know, and Durst won't make money. He has to treat us better if we stand in solidarity together. And they have all, you know, all kinds of techniques. You know, they have big meetings, you know, threatening to strike, you know, threatening to make a union. They have all these sort of tactics. Like they'd be giving speeches, and just to give you an idea of like how many different kinds of people that we have people translating the speech when they talk into German, Greek, Italian, Arabic, and Spanish. You know, because you'd have many different kinds of people here, and they're translating like as they're talking, and they even have songs. The IWW basically invented the protest song, and the idea of all of these people that don't speak the same language need to sort of get on the page and feel a sense of solidarity together. They can do that through music, and it's a peaceful form of protest. You know, when when times are tough, if we all sort of sing these songs together, then that will help give this sort of sense of solidarity. It's nonviolent. You know, it really upsets the the bosses that are doing this, but but the bosses can't fight back if they're being nonviolent. So they basically invented this sense of the protest song, which Woody Guthrie would then pick that up later. In generations down the line, with Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan. All of those songs have their roots. What we think of as folk music has its roots in these IWW songs. There's a song I want to play for you here. It's not super relevant, to all of this stuff, but I don't know. I think it's interesting. This is the type of song that you would have heard at if you were you're a striker, and you're singing these in the hop fields at Durst Ranch. And I have a link that's to this page that's up on from the PowerPoint there. And there's a whole bunch of these different Union songs. The one I'm going to play you here is by if you've ever heard the Mountain Goats indie band. Really, it's just one guy, this guy John Darnell, and this is him doing one of the protest songs. It's a pretty quick version.
There is power in a factory, there is power in the land, there is power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. Oh, there is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. The mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to the factories full of mud, war has always been the boss's way, sir. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black flag, all workers unite with our brothers and our sisters from many far-off lands. Oh, there is power in a union. Now I long for the morning when they all realize brutality and unjust laws cannot defeat us. But who'll defend the worker who cannot organize when the bosses send their lackeys, sir, to cheat us? Money speaks for money, the devil for his own. Who'll come to speak for the skin and the bone? What a comfort to the widow and a light to the child. Oh, there is power in a union. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black flag, all workers unite with our brothers and our sisters. Together we all stand. Oh, there is power in a union. Stay strong, Wisconsin. The Mountain Goats and every musician I know are with you.
The reason you brought Wisconsin into that because it was during the teachers' protest in Wisconsin. But you can imagine, the song of, hundreds of workers singing this song together and singing it in like 6 different languages. They're all singing together in sort of unified chorus. It's it's a very powerful thing to imagine that happening. So anyway, they're having these, doing these songs and giving these speeches and everything. Durst comes out and finds out what's going on. He fires the Wobblies, says, "You guys are troublemakers, you're fired." And he calls the sheriff to come and arrest them. But these guys are smart and they know their rights. Within the workers' camp, the sheriff can't just go and arrest them without a warrant. So they go on like giving their speeches, being like, look what they're trying to do to us. The sheriff leaves and comes back with more cops, with a local DA, basically all the law enforcement, in this area to shut these guys down. If not necessarily legally, they're gonna, through force. They're the law. They can basically do whatever they want at this time. And they start pushing through the crowd towards the makeshift stage, and we don't really know what happens. There's various accounts, but apparently one of the cops had fired a shotgun into the air to scare people. But rather than being scared, thinking they're being shot at and in these close quarters, the workers rushed in and started grabbing the guns of the cops. And this battle ensues, part gunfight, part, melee brawl. And when it ends, a deputy sheriff and a local district attorney and 3 workers are dead. Another worker has his arm completely blown off by a shotgun blast. In the wake of this, the workers are like, "Oh shit, scatter!" law enforcement are dead, they are going to crack down like crazy. We all got to get out of here. So, you have hundreds of people like fleeing as quickly as they can to get out of the wheatland area. And sure enough, law enforcement cracks down, goes and arrests any workers that they find, to find information about where the Wobblies are. Like, and it's definitely, there's cases of them like, not being taken to the sheriff's station, being brought to motel rooms and worked over, beaten up, to give up information and stuff like that. If you say, where's the IWW guys? This is all their fault for labor organizing. And all of the local newspapers are completely writing articles denouncing the Wobblies as being venomous human snakes who urged armed resistance to any constituted authority, and are thus the most dangerous and deadly wild animals of the jungle. Just because these guys are trying to form a union. And sure enough, they do track down the two Wobblies. They're put on trial for murder. And the IWW sends out two attorneys. They send out not fly because nobody flew back then, but by train, they send to defend these guys. And it's completely ridiculous. The defense attorneys try to push for a change of venue, but of course, drop another slide for this now. Defense attorneys push for another change of venue, but they won't do it. So these guys go on trial. Basically, just a bunch of farmers, who are just like Durst in this area. So they've already made up their minds. The judge was a good friend of the DA who was killed. It was really stacked against these guys from the beginning. And even though nobody said that they actually had fired any weapons or even up in the front of what was going on, they were convicted of murder because they had been pushing for a union. That was enough. Basically, they were agitators who set all this in motion. Despite any sort of evidence, they are both convicted of second-degree murder and have with life sentences in prison. They would eventually, life sentence. They do eventually get out on parole, and apparently they were convicted for the murder of the DA. And spent 10 years in prison. And when they were released, the sheriff was waiting by and arrested them to put them on trial for the murder of the deputy who was killed. Because they were only convicted of the one murder, but that charge was unable to stick, and they ended up getting released. But 10 years later, that guy was still holding a grudge. But this does actually, all of this brings attention to what was going on with migrant laborers. The governor gets involved and actually pushes for more laws and regulations that protect migrant workers. There will always be neglected people in society, despite how important they are to society. They're always treated badly, but this is sort of the beginning of them being treated better, and sort of thinking about how are we going to treat all of these people of different nationalities who are coming here. And it's good for the IWW, because migrant workers around California be like, hey, these guys got our back. They went to bat for us in this organization. They sent out lawyers. This is totally unjust, but these guys were here fighting the good fight. So a lot of the people joined up at the IWW after that, and there were strikes all around California pushing for harder stuff, and they were able to be much more effective with this sort of symbol behind them. A lot of this ties into the stuff that, I don't want to go too much into American history stuff, but as there are, as unions get stronger, and this is a time, like I said, those leftist politics was growing. During World War I, the Russian Empire falls and becomes the Soviet Union. There's a lot of terror of communism. And that might be this growing threat in the United States. And there is definitely quite a bit of that in California. And that all of this, adds up to this complete change in immigration. We've been seeing all of these different immigration laws, and some victories, for immigrants that get here, but still being treated badly. But basically, you still have this sense that all of these people are coming in from different parts of the world, and they're not assimilating enough, and they'll never be able to assimilate, and they're going to ruin American culture. The same stuff that was being said again about the Chinese in the 1870s. Now that, like, by the 1920s, they're saying that basically all of these immigrants that are coming in. And people always say that whatever new group comes in, these people are too different, they're not going to be able to assimilate. Then of course they do over time, but that argument was still popular amongst people. It seemed like Italians will never be able to assimilate, like, which is just insane. This is a time like nobody knew what like spaghetti was, and like you consider that ethnic food, and that spaghetti's going to destroy America if we all start eating spaghetti. Which is just pretty ridiculous. But this growing xenophobia pushes for this national. This is a federal law, this Immigration Act of 1924, which what it does is set quotas on each how many immigrants can come in from each country, and it's basically 3%. And this is sort of complicated. I'm not going to ask you to remember this exact thing. I mainly want you to remember there are quotas of for each country what they're allowing in. But they take the census records from 1890, not the recent 1920 census records. They look back at 1890 and say we are only taking 3% from of however many immigrants we had at that time. They're doing that because that was before there were all of these, Italians and Greeks and, Middle Eastern and Jewish immigrants. They're trying to, turn back the clock and let in as few of those people as possible, with the explicit purpose of keeping America white Protestant. They're very much straightforward about that, about preserving our ethnic hegemony. And this will close the door effectively on American immigration. There was very little immigration between 1924 and 1965. It's very difficult to come into this country. And, a large part of that, was this sort of changes in California, and of all of these immigrants coming in, and this worry that California would no longer be an American state, kind of thing. It also completely cuts off, where there was some quotas on, for other countries were allowed 3% of Italians, 3% of Portugal, things like that. It completely cuts off all Asian immigration. There was already the Chinese Exclusion Act is in effect. This is also going to apply to Japanese people, to Vietnamese, to all Asian immigration was completely cut off. I'm not sure. I don't think India was included in that. I don't think Southern Asian, because at the time India was part of the British Empire. But completely closing the door to Asia. This is where you see a lot of the term illegal alien is first used. Of course, we don't, imply company, we shouldn't use that term, anymore, because people can't be illegal. Actions are illegal, not people. But we call them undocumented immigrants today. But in the law is the first case where that term is used in the Immigration Act of 1924, for illegal alien appear. It also establishes the Border Patrol. There had been really no sense, nobody at the border, even though there were restrictions on immigration before this, especially for the Chinese. There was not really any sort of regulation of that. Now there would be this new law enforcement agency, the U.S. Border Patrol, whose sole job was to keep certain people out of the country. And now we tend to associate that with Latin American immigration. But that was not the case at the time. Actually, the Immigration Act of 1924 does not bar any Mexican or Central American or South American immigration. There's a few different reasons for this. it was like there was not in general as much discrimination against that's the sense that that you hear in the worst sort of Trump rallies of the idea of Mexicans are coming here and they're rapists and killers. That that had not been a thing yet. There's really not strong push towards limiting Latin American immigration until the 1950s. And part of that was because we needed those workers. What a lot of people today know, and a lot of racists choose to forget, is those Latin American workers are the food, they pick the food that feeds all of us. And especially here in California lawmakers pushed, say, like, do not close the southern border because we need those people to be able to come across the border and work and pick our fields. And a lot of them go home. They'll come across seasonally and then then go back to Mexico. So they wanted to be sure they kept that border open. So even though it does establish the border patrol and they would be down along the southern border, they're really not doing anything to stop Mexican American or Central American migration. You also have in this era, let me go, the first large waves of Black migrants coming to California. California had a very, very low African-American population. Even in the 1920s, which is what we're kind of talking about right here, it was still pretty low. It really picks up in the 1940s. The book you guys are reading, Living for the City. Oh wait, at least one class is reading that, the other class isn't. But that talks a lot about this. And so, but you do have, basically what it is, when World War I breaks out, tons of jobs open up, like in northern and western cities for the war. They did not have, there was no standing army, so that so they have to draft people and they have to build all the equipment. They have to make uniforms and they have to make bullets and jeeps and all of that kind of stuff that that they need to have a war. That all that needs to get made, so that factories do that. So they need people to work in those factories. So you had all of, most factories would be owned by racist people who aren't going to hire Black people. They can't be picky anymore about who they're hiring because they need to be putting out stuff fast. So when across the country and in big cities, in Chicago, in Detroit, this is when you see large pushes of African American migration coming out of the South and to those places. It's obvious why slavery was over, but this is in the time of Jim Crow, segregation. The Black populations had been treated horribly, but 90% of all African Americans still lived in the southern states because they didn't have any opportunities to go anywhere else before that. Now that these jobs opened up, they are going to go. Like I said, we don't have a lot of it. I'm bringing it up here as almost kind of like a setup for future lectures. There's not a lot of it in the 1920s, but in the 1940s, it will be, many Black Southern migrants are going to show up in California cities, in Oakland, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. We're going to have a whole separate lecture about that. Basically, what the changes in California that happened in World War II. But I'm bringing this up now because the Great Migration plus all of the other immigration that had been building up and the Red Scare and all of this sort of xenophobia gave rise to a new version of the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan had basically disappeared after Reconstruction. After the 1870s, like, the KKK won. Basically, they almost are fighting like a secret guerrilla terrorist war in places like Mississippi and Alabama and things like that. And when the Union troops left that the South in 1877, the KKK didn't need to be in masks anymore. They could lynch people, masks off. They didn't. There's no reason to have it. They won. They put all these laws in place that oppressed the black population. But there was this sort of like mythic idea of like people actually viewed the KKK as heroes. It sounds insane today, but so the predominant view, especially from Southerners, was the Ku Klux Klan were this necessary group of vigilantes. People saw them as almost being like the Committee of Vigilance. It's like, oh yeah, they had to do these things, but they had to restore order in the South. And especially after this 1915 movie came out, Birth of a Nation, which you've surely heard of before, not the one that came out a few years ago called Birth of a Nation. This is 1915. It's really the first action movie ever made. There's all kinds of stuff about why this movie is important to cinema. D.W. Griffith, the director, uses all these interesting shots in it, and for those for a cinephile, or someone that's into film history, it's a huge movie for that. But the movie just happens to be about how the KKK, fought this, secret guerrilla war in the South. The KKK are the heroes of that movie. And when this movie comes out in 1915, it's played in theaters across the country for years. It'll be playing. People loved it. They couldn't get enough. Like calling it like Avengers Endgame is like minuscule next to like how big this movie was, especially because there was not very many movies back then. So it would, like I said, it would play in theaters for years afterward. And in the 1920s, because of the Great Migration and because of all of this immigration fear that people had, people like how do we fight back against black people showing up in our cities? How do we fight back against these Catholic Italians showing up in our farms? Well, we're going to copy the movie, put on robes, and become vigilantes. Recapture our our country. We're taking our country back. That kind of bullshit. That's sort of where there had been America had been pushing for this long time towards like sort of progressive action and more multiculturalism. This is part with the Immigration Act of 1924, the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the ultimate reaction to it. And we here in California, there was a huge Klan presence. Like I said, I'll come back to this. Here, there was not a lot of African Americans here, but there were all of these, Southern European migrants, and that the Ku Klux Klan in California, that was what they saw themselves as fighting against, is trying to scare off. Scare these people out of here. They were not as violent as some other versions of the Klan, especially as not as much as the 1870s Klan in the South. But they did burn crosses on people's lawns, things like that. And actually, it's funny because the old Ku Klux Klan, the original one, never burnt crosses. That was just not a thing they did. But when making Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, the idea of a burning cross on the night sky just looked really cool. He just thought it was a cool image, so he puts it into the movie. So all of these idiots across the country who are starting up their own Ku Klux Klan chapters, like what do we do to intimidate people? Oh, burn crosses. That's what they do. That's what the original one did. And they're just, like I said, they're just copying the movie. This picture is really not apropos of anything. Some of these slides that I use in some of my other classes, that American history classes, so we don't have to worry about most of these. But I do think this is weird. Like in Colorado here, it's Ku Klux Klan chapter riding a Ferris wheel. Why they thought they could look tough while riding a Ferris wheel? I mean, I guess they kind of do. No, as much as tough as you can look while riding a Ferris wheel. I don't know. I'll never understand that. But where I live here in Oakland, there was a huge Ku Klux Klan chapter. There's pictures of these rallies. The bottom picture here is at the Kaiser Center, which is an auditorium that is not there anymore, but of this huge, Ku Klux Klan rally. You can't quite see it, but they're burning a cross. That's like that's sort of up in the stands there. And there was regular cross burnings. They would have huge parades across the city. There was even in Alameda County, there was a Ku Klux Klan sheriff. Like literally, he ran for sheriff, and for his party nomination, I am a my party is Ku Klux Klan, and he ran and won as sheriff. And for a number of years, there's this KKK sheriff in Alameda County. The cities that we both, I have both classrooms in Hayward and Santa Rosa for this, had Ku Klux Klan chapters that were active and had parades and things like that. My grandmother was a little girl at the time, and growing up in Long Beach, and she remembered KKK parades. It didn't really understand what it was, and her mother was very, very anti-Klan, but and they had recently come over from Oklahoma, and they were often discriminated against themselves. But she has these memories of Ku Klux Klan walking around in her neighborhood, and in that area of Long Beach, one of the big things that they're fighting against. I talked about this sort of all these people coming from the Midwest, like very religious people that were, progressive. But in the 1920s, that had bubbled up to a lot of sort of racism and resentment. And a lot of those, very Christian people were also, like I said, very racist. And some of the worst attacks against immigrants were in that area. There's one in the town of Inglewood of the Klan attacked this Spanish Basque family. They thought they were bootlegging, and we're going to talk more about prohibition later on. But they suspected this Klan was sneaking in alcohol or making their own alcohol, and they kicked open the door, beat up the father and the mother. They raped the two teenage girls in the family, and law enforcement actually showed up while this was happening. And they ended up having a shootout between the police and the Klan, and a number of the Klansmen were shot dead. And when they took off their hoods, they found out they were also local law enforcement too. A bunch of them were on like the Long Beach Police Department and things like that. And the Long Beach Police Department actually had, the police chief said, like, you can't be a vigilante and be a police officer at the same time. You choose between the Klan and the Long Beach Police, and a lot of them chose the Klan. So that gives you sort of an idea, of how they operate around here. Again, there's not the Klan that we think of as being all about attacking African Americans. This new Klan, this 1920s Klan, was much more inclusive about who they hated. This had a much broader brush. And yeah, that's going to be, very anti-immigrant, and yeah, is definitely be tied to prohibition as well. We'll talk about this a little bit. I think I might have even just said everything that I'm going to mention with that, but I'm going to talk about prohibition in California next week. Okay, do I have everything I wanted to say about this? I think so. So let's see, we're just under an hour. I'm sure I want to get to this part. Yeah, let's just, short day, forget it. I think that's enough. So, you have different quizzes on different days. Be sure you check for when those quizzes are. Zoom meetings as well. Check Blackboard or Canvas for when those Zoom meetings and quizzes are. All right, I will talk to you guys later.